have an issue.
People claim that the struggle was worse for one.
I think that's just a part of Twitter.
People who are saying more millennials,
They get the likes, the retweets and stuff like that.
We just want what's good for us. So moving forward,
Oh, is what you say in like 2010? Welcome back to the Soapbox, where we discuss topics within our popular culture. Today we're going to be talking about Black Americans versus West Indians versus Africans versus Latinos and the issues within those that matter. To my right of me, we have Adrian at Midas Site. We have Kristen, got Kristen Reed, and we have Vanessa, your girl Annie. And to my left, we have Joseph, Black_Jesus, and you have Alvin, Black Calvin the Third.
Alvin. Alvin.
I'm sorry, I don't know why I said Calvin.
I don't either.
Black Alvin 3.
There we go.
And your host, me, Classic Vin, at Classic_Vin. That's 2 N's. All right, we're gonna get this topic started. Is there a true division between the cultures? And if so, what are your personal grievances? Go.
Anybody want to start off? No? Okay, I'll start off. Yes. I'm originally from Los Angeles, where we have a pretty big Black and Latino population, and or Hispanic. Growing up, I did not get a chance to really be exposed to Caribbean cultures or African cultures. Like I said, mostly Black and Latino cultures. I didn't really get exposed to that till I came, till I started seeing the world, actually. And I started to realize that the way that people think was very different. And even though it was very different from each other, there were still these internal conflicts that were always a part of it. Mm-hmm. And it's not anything that necessarily we started. You know, these have been going on for generations prior to us. But even still, there always felt like there was this little bit of division between each of the cultures where, like, there were so similar experiences that one wanted to be, like, almost better than the other, or to some degree, like, hey, well, we've gotten it worse than you guys, and you can't top that. And then the other one's like, but we had it like this for so long. So I don't know. That's just how I always saw it growing up.
I mean, can I pitch in right now?
Yeah.
I think also the division between, you know, Caribbean culture having so many languages and then Latinos too. Like, we don't all speak the same language, which also automatically puts a division. And then, yeah, like he was saying, like, people claim that the struggle was worse for one part or the other, which is, I can agree to an extent, but at the same time, I think overall we all fall under the same category of just being Black at the end of the day. Yeah. But some people wouldn't agree because I'm Hispanic. They wouldn't see my Blackness as something that's valid due to not being directly from the motherland, since I have other things tied into my heritage too.
Yeah, makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can definitely agree. And it's not really full on. Like, obviously it exists, but from my experience growing up Jamaican grandmother, I'm half Jamaican actually. In my experience, like, just the way how my grandmother talked about Black people from America, meaning African American descendants of slaves, it was always just with a twinge of bias to where it's like, it's not big enough to where it's like, okay, that's a problem, but you definitely could tell that it was there, and it was definitely a lot more subconscious, and even some of the terminology that they used to use in Jamaica to describe them. I would say it's a problem. I think that it's kind of reminiscent of larger forces in general trying to pit us against each other. But yeah, I would definitely say it's a problem today.
I definitely, I definitely agree with that. Because growing up, I have 2 African parents. I was born in Maryland in a predominantly Black and Hispanic community. So I didn't know about, there being a bias. I just thought, okay, some of us are Black and some of us are Spanish, but not even just my parents, but hearing other Africans talk, it would be like, don't follow those Black Americans, but it was just like, what's the difference? We're all the same color, we all live in the same neighborhood, like, at this point, we all have the same social status. So what's the difference? And I think the bias really comes from, I didn't want to be the one to bring it up, but slavery really, because, you know, that was their way to keep us down by dividing us and pitting us against each other when really we all come from one place, and that's Africa.
For me, I'm from the Cayman Islands. I'm raised there. I live there right now. My father's from Jamaica. My mother's from the Bahamas. And in our household, we never were taught to like look down on other Black people. Like I was taught about American culture in my house. I was taught about the Maroons in Jamaica. I was taught about every culture relating to Blackness. It wasn't until I got to the States where I was aware of the divide. And I got here, I was having a conversation with this one dude, and he told me that I wasn't Black. And I was like, huh? I was like, look at me. I was like, and we were talking about it, and he was saying that my struggle doesn't equate to African Americans.
Right.
So therefore, I'm not Black. And we really shouldn't think of Blackness it shouldn't be defined by our struggle. And I think that's why there is a divide. Well, I know for me, the other divide that we have is that we don't necessarily fully embrace African Americans who have like Bahamian or Bayesian parents, right? Because they have a different upbringing. And I think that's another divide that we have. Yeah.
Okay, so talking about the divide, I want to hear from you guys. What are some negative stereotypes that people have identified with your culture, and what would you like to see, and how would you like them to be stopped?
So you're asking us like.
So what negative connotations or stereotypes have you seen being a part of your culture? So for me, I'm Guyanese and Trinidadian. Shout out to my people, them. But people love to say that Guyana is not a part of the Caribbean because we're in South America. But at the end of the day, we are. So the topic for another day. So for me, it would be like, I hate that. So for you guys, what's a negative stereotype?
I mean, I think I could hop on that too, because like me being half Cuban, I feel like we're not really considered. We are the heart of the Caribbean, but at the same time, because we speak Spanish, it's kind of a division. And I hate that people kind of block us off and they call us like fake Black because we're still Hispanic and Latino all at the same time. That's the thing that I don't like about what's on us personally.
Got you. Being African American, like, and this even goes into like some of what you were talking about with how Africans specifically will like tell you, hey, don't run with that crowd. Or at least growing up for me, like I tended to hear, or at least on the African side of things, because like I said, only other culture that I was really around was Latino / Hispanic culture. Sometimes Jamaican culture because my grandmother's Jamaican, born and raised, but that's another story. The things that I heard were things like, you know, Black Americans are lazy. They don't want to. They don't want to work. They don't want to, you know, take care of the things that they need to take care of. And then you see these Africans. You know, they come over. You know, they got the nice houses. They got the nice cars. You know, they got everything that they need to make sure that their kids are set up for success. And there's nothing wrong with that. Yeah. But using that as a comparison to what's going on, say, with a family like mine, is unfair to me because the opportunity that you had to come over to the States is a lot different from being born and raised in the States and having to struggle with everything that's a part of that. An African is not going to necessarily understand the struggle that, say, my family had to go through being raised, you know, trying to get me and my two brothers into college. Not only getting us into college, but helping us finish, you know, 4 years of college. And depending on who you ask, there might be the generalization that African Americans are just lazy. You know, they don't want to do the work. That we want handouts. That we want to be given the things to us, and that's not necessarily the case. Because historically speaking, we've just been wanting to be treated as human beings, and that's been it. The problem is, it only just, relatively speaking, recently happened in the 60s or so, and we're still fighting for some specific things to this day. But at the same time, if you cannot recognize that that is where we're coming from, then it's unfair to make a very big generalization and stereotype about the whole culture because you just don't understand what's going on. America's a big place, and we got a lot going on for ourselves.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I agree with him. Like I said, talking about my grandmother, it's a little extreme, but Nana used to tell us, don't date Black women, as in not Caribbean women, but black women from the States who are descendants of slaves. And I never fully understood why she would say it, but she always pictured that she said either date Latino or date somebody Caribbean because she deemed them to be harder working. And I don't know if that's just because that's where she's from. But I do feel that a certain part boils down to miseducation and not being able to understand other people's cultures. I feel that that's where a lot of bias towards other cultures comes from in general, is not fully understanding or becoming acquainted. And I feel that as black people, we are not acquainted with other people's cultures enough. I think we just kind of stick to ourselves, to our own, rather than familiarizing ourselves with other people's culture. And so I feel that that might be where some of the bias starts to come in.
Do you guys think that the bias or the miseducation came from the fact that the people from the Caribbean or people from Africa, when they have to migrate to the United States, they have to do certain things to have a good living. And for people who were raised in the States, I'm not saying that anything that y'all said wasn't invalid,
Right.
but I'm just trying to understand your reasoning and try to pinpoint where this came from. For people who were raised in the States, they already kind of have a standing, and so that they can somewhat become complacent. But for people who migrate, they have to do certain things to become complacent the way that African Americans can be. Do we think that?
I think that I get what you're saying,
Yeah.
and I agree with you because there's a lot that an African immigrant is going to have to do in relation to what I have to do as a black man that's already here. Naturalized, this is my country, this is where I was born and raised. At the same time, I think it's important not to compare the struggles of the two.
Absolutely.
Because if you have an African immigrant or a Caribbean immigrant that is coming over to, let's say, just build a better life for them and their children. That is different from, say, me who is trying to, trying to get through college to build a life for me and my children. The struggles are very different from each other, and that entails a lot of different things. That's a part of it, but at the same time, it's like comparing apples and oranges, quite literally. What the African immigrant is going to have to do in order to be considered legitimate in America is a lot different than what I have as a black man have to do to be considered legitimate by my own country people. See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So if I have to do certain things as a black man in order to be considered a legitimate citizen of the United States, even though I'm quite literally, legally speaking, a legitimate citizen of the United States, that's a whole different story from the African immigrant who has to be recognized legally first. And even when you go into that, now we're getting into what America deems is the perfect quote unquote immigrant. There's a reason why they consider Asians the quote unquote perfect race,
Just
I guess, if that
what
makes
the president.
sense. You know what I'm saying? Like they'll treat Asians as this is the perfect demographic. They go to work, they don't talk about American politics, they do what they need to do and they stay to themselves. Black people, we don't have that.
That luxury.
We don't have exactly. We don't have that luxury because we were brought over forcibly. Because we were treated in such a way for 400 plus years. There's a lot that we have to do just to be considered regular citizens, even though we are that. And so what the African immigrant has to do is a lot different, and that's why.
But I do think that when it comes to African immigrants and Caribbean immigrants, to white people, there's no difference.
Right.
So there's a lot of Caribbean people that I can't pinpoint their names, a specific one, that were civil rights activists because they have the same problems, is that they're still considered Negroes. So I definitely get what you're saying, and I everything that you're saying is valid, and I agree with you. But I do think that the struggle is somewhat the same, but we do divide ourselves, like what we're talking about.
Just real quick, and I want to get to that because I just wanted to speak on one thing. Just take the comparison. Let's just say a 20-year-old black man. Take a 20-year-old black man from, say, Compton, which is around the area where I'm from, and then you take, say, a 20-year-old Caribbean immigrant. The way that these two are treated is so vastly different from each other, depending on who you're talking to and depending on the situation. They're so vastly what did I just say? Different. I'm sorry. They're so vastly different from each other that it would only be recognized in that situation. Me personally, because that's where I'm from, and also kind of the way that I look, white people are going to look at me a lot different from, say, the really well-dressed Caribbean who has to do everything that he needs to do in order to be, go to work or get citizenship, do whatever he needs to do in order to, live and work in the United States. But there's already a certain bias within the States about me as a black man.
Yeah.
A Caribbean or an African does not have that same bias because they already know I already have to come over here and get to work immediately. And I have no other option. The African immigrant is I got to go get my green card. I got to go to work. I can't sacrifice this. I got to go do this. I got to do that. And then in my sense, I have to do some of these same things. But because I'm dealing with a different bias based off of who I am, because of generations of stereotypes that have been placed upon me, now I have to operate in a different sense that's away from that.
But what about someone who is a Caribbean immigrant and they migrate to your neighborhood and they're living in the same place? They have their green card, they have all those other things, and they're working the same jobs. Do you not think that they have to battle with those same stereotypes?
I think they have to battle with those same stereotypes, and I think they have to battle with more now because now they have to make sure that they're not seen as a lazy immigrant. But at the same time, like I said, it's unfair to compare what they have to do to what I have to do being born and raised here and still already be considered a bad influence, a thug, gangster, whatever it is that you want to call me. But these are already stereotypes that I have to break through.
Yeah.
At least as an immigrant, from my limited perspective, at least you don't have to deal with that specifically. At least you could just be I'm an immigrant from another. And I'm not saying that you won't. It's more like you're now coming into a problem. I was born into this problem.
Okay.
You can deal with it a lot differently than I can because I'm literally, this is what I've been born and raised. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So you've been not necessarily desensitized, but you've learned to deal with it. That's what you're saying?
Almost, because it's like in certain situations, there's just certain things you can't get by. I can walk down the street and have a white woman cross the street and lock her door on me. It just is what it is.
Yeah.
He might have to deal with the same things, but I'll put it to you like this. He's light-skinned, I'm more dark-skinned.
Yeah.
They're going to probably assume that I would be the one to steal over him, and that's just based off of skin color.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's why it's like, what I've born and raised in is different from what you have to come into.
Yeah.
To Kristen's point, though, I feel even as a black person, it's unless someone is is really from a different culture and that's not their ancestry, that's literally where they were from. I feel after a certain point it becomes hard to differentiate whether you are just black or if you have that specific upbringing.
Yeah.
So what kind of extent of, say, problems might an immigrant face then if, let's say, if we're talking about white people, how much of white people are going to actually know the difference between an immigrant and a black
will they
person?
care?
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Because, like, I mean,
Yeah.
even as a black person myself,
Yeah.
like, after a certain point, maybe I might find out that you're originally from Africa, or maybe I'll find out you're
Yeah.
Trinidadian. Like, I just found out that you're Trinidadian on
Yeah.
this podcast. But, like, if it takes me, a black person, this long to find out that you're an immigrant, then how long is it going to take everybody else? And if it's
A
going
white
to take
police officer.
that,
Yeah.
if they're never going to know,
Yeah.
then what kind of struggle is different from an immigrant versus, say,
Someone
a
who's
black
born
person,
here.
unless we're talking about from the focal point of a black person
Yeah.
and how immigrants feel that they have to relate themselves to
Yeah.
black people.
I think the only thing that's different in the struggle is the migration process. Once you're here, you're a black person. Because I have 50 friends in Cayman right now who look exactly like you.
I believe that.
Who have locks, who have beards, and have that same complexion, and who not exactly,
Right.
because you're your own person,
Yeah.
but look like you, who come to the States, whether they're going for school, but they know about the struggle. Because even though we're in the Caribbean, we're very Americanized, especially where I am. I knew all about American history before I learned about West Indian history, which is crazy.
Yeah, that is
So
pretty crazy.
I have a clear understanding of the struggle. So I think the only thing that's different in our struggle is the migration process for those who are migration. But once you're here, you're black.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, I want to pose an interesting question, and I
Go for it.
tap into your content. I do feel because descendants of slaves, African American people who were originally from Africa, because they don't necessarily have a culture to fall back on, that's kind of what contributed to African black people creating their own culture.
Yeah.
How do you guys feel of how? Do you feel that black people then, from that sense, kind of have to protect that culture because, say, immigrants already have a culture that they can fall back on. You're Jamaican, you're Trinidadian.
Yeah.
For Black people, it's really just the culture that they
Yeah.
had to create from the ground up.
Honestly, I've seen it in a different way because I've seen it in reverse, where Black people are usually very, as in African Americans, they're very open with other Black people with their culture. Because I remember, I think the beginning of hip hop, they had DJ Cool Herc, I think that was his name, and he was a Jamaican. Was he? I think he was a Jamaican DJ at the time, and he was one of the main people that started hip hop, right? But when it comes to Caribbean people, and I can even say this with myself, even though it's a bad thing, is that we're very protective about our culture. So I've come, especially at Oakwood, there have been situations, when I got here, I was the only Caymanian, I didn't know anybody. I knew one person from the Bahamas, and that was about it. And I wanted to find people that I could connect with, because it's much different having connection with someone who's African American and then someone else who shares your own culture. So there was at times I'd meet someone and they would tell me, oh, I'm from Bermuda, or like I'm from, let's say Jamaica, and I would get really excited. And then I was like, oh yeah, so what part of Jamaica are you from? It's like, oh no, my great-grandfather is from Jamaica. Nah, it's not the same. It's not the same. And it's like, we understand that you share a culture, you probably were immersed in it as a child, but it's much different from living there than living in the States and having your mother tell you what ackee saltfish is. It's very different. So I feel that Caribbean and African people are very protective of their own culture. I've never really seen it with African Americans though. Yeah.
A follow-up question.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
A follow-up question is, and I see this a lot in Latino culture as well, is that how do you guys think that immigrants feel towards people who have already immigrated and are starting to lose some of their ways? Because I do know that a lot of people don't really think of me as Jamaican because I didn't grow up in Jamaica. I had a Jamaican grandmother. I ate the food. I speak patois.
Yeah.
But it's nothing like growing up actually in Jamaica. Do you guys think that there's a form of bias towards Americanized immigrants versus being fresh immigrants who have, say, all the history and the culture that they have?
I think there definitely is a bias because for me, like, Spanish was my first language, but in the American system, you speak English your whole life, just English all the way, so I lost it. And then I think even the other day when we had the Hispanic event here, like, I was noticing, like, other Hispanics were there, other Latinos were there, and it was cool. Like, I can connect with them on a certain level, but not enough to the point where it can be genuine because they look at me as an Americanized Afro-Latina, which is also a different thing because there are the white Latinos and there are the black Latinos. And then sometimes there's an in-between, there's like, you mix with Native American and everything like that, which is a completely different ballpark, but it's like, okay, which one do you fit into? And am I allowed to, I guess, involve myself with those who are from there instead of being Americanized, So it's kind of this border that's up because, again, with the whole protecting the culture thing, even though we share the same culture, which is kind of weird. But yeah, there definitely is a bias.
I can definitely agree with that because even though I was born here, Sango is the language of my parents' country. I speak it really well, but like I would meet like their friends and they'd be like, "Oh, you speak the language so well, but you're not a true African." I'm just like, kind of, And so like I totally understand where you're coming from, and it's weird because I just thought like it was like that in the African community, but it's weird to know like it also happens
and then
across the board.
Can I go back to what you were saying about how immigrants come here to build better lives for their families? And that's what my dad did. He came from Cuba, whole process, everything. He came here to make a better life for us, and things were cool. And so to me, it's kind of weird because if our families fought so hard to be here, why are you disowning us? If that's what you wanted the whole time, then why is it a bad thing?
Right.
And we're finally here. That's what I have to say.
But yeah, it definitely happens in the Caribbean culture. And even though I don't like that I have it, I definitely do have a bias because the difference of connecting with someone who has been immersed and grew up in that culture. And it's different when you're just, okay, you're in the States, and even though you have Caribbean parents, it's just so different.
Right.
Yeah. It's almost like, I almost wrote an article on it where it's almost like having mixed kids, where Black people almost don't see mixed kids as being like Black almost because it's a different
You have a
culture.
whole different
Yeah, it's different. So you have a white family. I mean, a white
Yeah, you have a white
father.
family, yeah.
It's different from being like fully Black. Yeah, but we shouldn't have that bias though. Yeah.
So now going back to protecting the culture, do you think it's worth trying to protect each and every single individual culture?
I think to some degree it is, but
From white people.
to some degree, I think to some degree it is important to do that, but at the same time, it is not okay to be so close-minded that you're not accepting. And you guys even spoke on this a little bit too, how the Black American culture is very open, and you have to put that into a little bit of historical context because from the jump, we were taken from our original homes to have our culture quite literally stripped from us, to be injected with a foreign culture. And then after, let's say, independence, or excuse me, not independence, emancipation. You get to emancipation, and then from that point on, that was the people, the Black people in America now trying to build a culture for themselves. And from the beginning, from the onset of that, the white people of the nation have always tried to destroy said culture. And so our culture has always actually been a rebellion towards the status quo because from jump, it was always a rebellion. You know, slaves are only going to be slaves for so long, and by the time they're not, now we have to build our own lives in a place that is not necessarily natural to us. So now you get into, now we're getting into, say, hip hop, for instance, jazz, rock and roll. All of these, for instance, and this is just music genres, all of these music genres can be traced back to white people, or excuse me, to Black people. But guess who took over it? White people took over it. That is a prime example of how Black Americans have tried to create a culture for ourselves, for it to be taken from us, and then profited off of.
Appropriation.
And quite literally, we don't get the credit that we are due. In situations like that, when you have a culture like the Black American culture, which is very open and honest with each other, and then you take Caribbean culture and African culture, which is very kind of like, this is our kind of thing, and we're going to protect it as such. We have had to be like that because we have never really had allies for us. So we have to try and get everybody that we can because that's the only way that this is going to be able to survive. That's why, say, hip hop, for instance, has so many different little facets all around the world now because Blackness is not, it's not relegated to just America. Blackness is everywhere. Blackness is in Africa. Blackness is in the British, or excuse me, the UK. It's in the Caribbean. It's in even South America and some of the Latino countries, like you said. But that is not something that we're going to say, you can't do that because you're not from America. You have a struggle that you live through. And if you want to talk about it, and that's your medium of talking about it, then you should do that. But, you know, if I, as a Black man, were to go into your African home and necessarily, you know, try and assimilate myself into that, I can almost guarantee they're going to look at me and be like, you can do that all you want to, but you're not really African. You're not really African. Same thing with probably a Caribbean household. You can come here and eat all the Ackee sausage that you want, but you're not really, you know, my grandmother was Jamaican and she was also raised in Guatemala, so I have a little bit of Latino influence and a lot of Caribbean influence, at least in my life. But if I were to tell anybody that my grandmother's Jamaican, and I say I'm Jamaican, they're gonna be like, dude, you're twice removed from your grandmother. You're a quarter, barely. And you're from America. You're not Jamaican. But I ate a bunch of plantain growing up. Because you know what I'm saying? Like my grandmother made it. She literally would get up in the morning, make refried beans and plantain in the morning. And that was part of my upbringing. But aside from that, I'm not in Caribbean culture like that. But that doesn't mean I can be excluded from it either.
I do think that the presence of cultural appropriation does make things extremely different for all three different cultures. Because even with the Caribbean, we were on the same boat, on the same, came from the same dog and just went different ways. And when we're dropped off in the Caribbean, we were just given more freedom to be who we are. Because even with independence, Britain didn't really
they didn't really care.
They didn't really care. Even with the Cayman Islands, we're still under Britain, but they don't care about us. So we have more freedom to do that. And we didn't really have such a huge divide between races in the Caribbean that y'all had in the States. And definitely the presence of cultural appropriation makes things so much different.
I think I have to disagree only in that I know some people have said that Black culture as opposed to Caribbean culture or other different cultures needs to be more open. I feel that it actually needs to be more protected. And I think it's easy to mention, white people for cultural appropriation because, I mean, it happens all the time.
Yeah.
But I feel that Black cultural appropriation is a conversation that needs to be had as well, specifically because Black culture has been exploited for so long by so many different groups that, to me, it just doesn't feel fair that if you have no identity, so you've had to craft your own, it doesn't feel fair that anybody who already has a pre-established culture can assimilate it, take the best parts, but then still not be down for the cause or still
And
be
that's
able
our
to.
problem that we
Exactly.
That's the problem that we have.
Exactly.
Because I relate to I feel like I relate to the Black struggle a lot, especially when it comes to, like, say, music or something that I enjoy. And I feel that that happens a lot with all the Black cultures because, we're all the same shade, relatively speaking.
Yeah.
But when it comes to other issues, I feel that, you might not get as much support. And that's when it really just boils down to the fact that, sure, maybe we all have faced systemic oppression, but there still has been a special group of people that were enslaved here in this country for X
In a much
amount of
different
time.
way as well.
So,
Absolutely.
so at the same time, I do feel that Black culture needs to be protected even from different cultures, and that maybe there needs to just be more dialogue about it, but Black people, like Black culture, has been exploited.
What
for
would
way
you
too
say
long.
about other cultures who've contributed to the culture that we have now? So if we're just talking about hip hop, with like DJ Kool Herc that I was talking about, he was a Jamaican man who was I think he was an MC at one point that was putting reggae beats into different things, and he became one of the founders of hip hop. What would you say about that?
I think-
Should we protect it from, even though he's Jamaican, should we still protect the culture from people outside of
I think it's
America?
important to understand, especially when we talk about hip hop, because it's very easy to use that because it's so prevalent in today's society. It's important to realize that hip hop was always the expression of a struggle. Anybody can express said struggle. Don't get me wrong, there's a difference between the hip hop and rap that's happening in Chicago, the hip hop and rap that's happening in Atlanta, and say the hip hop and rap that's happening in Los Angeles. But at the same time, at its core, it is just the expression of a struggle. Take, for instance, NWA, right? The things that they talked about back then in I believe it was the 80s when they were big, it's still relevant to this day. Like, to this day, to the T, all the words that they said is still relevant to this day. Some of the things that, let's take Bob Marley, for instance, because even his influence on hip-hop culture is really big, comparatively speaking, to a lot of different outside influences. His struggle to this day, and the things that even he talked about, is still relevant to this day.
Absolutely.
So I think it's important to understand, especially when it comes to music. Music is not something that can just be boxed in. Especially when you take the African American struggle and you begin to therefore broadcast it out into the world. And now say Africans are seeing that, Caribbean people are seeing that, even Latino people are seeing it, because I'm now noticing that there's a bigger Latino insertion into hip hop that wasn't necessarily there before. It's all the expression of a struggle. And if people can relate to said struggle, then they're going to want to gravitate toward it. Now they're going to want to use that medium to push their story. So I don't think that it's necessarily right to say, well, we have to protect Black American hip hop, because Black American hip hop has had such a profound influence on our brothers and sisters of the diaspora. But at the same time, and even like you were saying, I think it's important for us to realize that what we have is kind of like the goose that laid the golden eggs. And if we let too many people get their hands on it, that goose is going to get ripped apart.
People. And we talked about in the first one where people like random white girls who don't talk about anything and who just appropriate Black women. They shouldn't be allowed to
Miley Cyrus is a really good example of that, because she literally used Black people in the Black experience to make her money, and then when she saw that she wasn't making it anymore,
contributing to the culture.
she was like, I'm not really like that. Oh, I was never like that, and I'm going to distance myself from it. And we were all like, okay, but we all knew this, you know?
But
We
Miley-
saw what she was doing.
But at the same time, though, like I was saying, though, Miley Cyrus is too easy. Like, that's too easy.
Yeah.
But what about Bruno Mars? Like, someone who is not necessarily, like, African-American, but he still fits into the general people of color category. How do we feel about him borrowing certain aspects of
the culture.
Black culture?
Yeah.
And How far does that extend?
I
Like,
think-
Yeah.
what's reasonable?
I think
Yeah.
the extent of that can be based upon your, I wouldn't necessarily say feeling. I guess it really goes back to giving credit where credit is due. If you take Bruno Mars, for instance, I think the reason why he gets a pass for the most part is because he understands the concepts of what he's a part of. For the
Yeah.
most part. I'm not going to
Right.
speak for everything, but for the most part, he understands that what he is a part of is bigger than him, and he cannot act as if he's the first one to do it.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, Bruno
He's not
Mars has
appropriating
Bruno Mars has a great voice. He can
Yeah.
sing his butt off. But at the same time, he's not out here treating it as something where he's like, I'm Bruno Mars and I'm the first person to do what I'm doing. No, you're not,
Yeah.
friend. And just because, you have Filipino in you does not mean that, you are some upper echelon mixed artist that is doing so much better than the rest of these black artists that aren't getting as much clout as you.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you can still make your music. There's nothing wrong with you making your music. But I think it's important to give credit where it is due.
Yeah.
Understand that this was created for a specific purpose, and you using that music to make your money,
Yeah.
Right.
that's not okay.
Yeah.
People use this as a way to express themselves. It wasn't ever about the money. There's a reason why Ice Cube left NWA, because it wasn't about the money. I mean, it was about the money, but at
Yeah.
the same time, his artistic expression was therefore being stifled because there was a certain agenda being pushed. And he was like, bro, listen, if y'all gonna pay me my money, pay me my money. But at the
Yeah.
same time, even when he left, it was still artistic expression.
Yeah.
And there's a reason why he made that music. It was never about, oh, I'm gonna use this because he used it and he made a lot of money on it. I want to do it too. No,
It
this is
shouldn't be a marketing
this is
tool.
my story.
Yeah.
This is what I want to talk
Yeah.
about. And if you don't have anything to talk about, we can tell, especially because we're the ones who created it.
Right.
If you're Bruno
Right.
Mars and you're just singing songs just because somebody's writing it for you,
Yeah.
we're going to look at your songs differently than the guy who's down the street who's writing about his
Yeah.
experience,
Right.
who can also sing just as good, if not better than you.
Yeah.
But he's not getting recognition because he's from the hood.
Right.
And nobody wants to take that chance. But Bruno Mars has all the qualities of what's considered a great celebrity.
Right.
So I think it's
Yeah.
important, if you're in that specific sense, to understand that your platform can be used for something that's greater than you. And if you cannot use that platform, not even can, won't use that platform for whatever reason to protect your image, to protect your money, that's when there's an issue.
Yeah.
Has blackness become that ingrained with oppression to where we start to judge mediums or even judge people by
Yeah.
the different levels of experience that
I
they've
think
had with
flip,
it?
I think flip the question. Is it not necessarily that blackness has been ingrained in oppression, or has oppression been ingrained into blackness? Because from its onset, black people in America were always oppressed. And
Right.
from us even trying to fight for our rights, we still continue to be oppressed. And even to this day, to some extent, depending on who you ask, we're still oppressed
Yeah.
in this modern day and age. So it's important to understand that from the onset, oppression was always a part of blackness. It's a horrible thing, especially to really think about when you get into the facets of all of that. But at the same time, it's just something that we have to deal with. There's still a reason why black people act the way we do, because there's just generations of a culture that was quite literally forced and beat into us. And we can't. It would probably take another 800 years to get out of the 400 plus years of oppression that we went through. You know what I'm saying?
not
Because
hope
there's so much generational trauma that falls into that. So I want to give this to you guys, but I just wanted to make that clarification of, is it necessarily blackness that's a part of oppression, or oppression that is quite literally a part of blackness itself? Because it's so braided so deeply into how we act and how we function and how we think.
I think it just goes
So-
back to the first point that I made, where that reasoning it's valid, but it's toxic. Because the first point that I made is that when I got here, the guy called me that I wasn't black.
Right.
And just based on the fact that I was from the Caribbean,
Right.
and that my experience wasn't the same. But we shouldn't equate blackness to the struggle, because you're still black by genetics. You're still black. You still, the hair, the face, everything else. You're still a black person, and we shouldn't equate the struggle. Yeah.
Right.
So staying on this topic, I want you're an Afro-Latina, so I would like you to talk about your experiences with this.
Okay, so my story is kind of funny because Afro-Latino, the whole movement wasn't really even a thing until a couple of years ago. And so the way I grew up, I did come from a very ignorant background, to where we were just Cuban. We weren't anything else. I was like, okay, but my cousins look like black people. We live like black people. We're treated the same way as black people. We talk, we look, everything was the same. We are black, are we not? And every time I brought that up, they're like, that's not something you say. We don't claim that. We're not that. We are just Cuban. Same way Dominicans are. We are just Dominican. We don't come from anything else but from the Dominican Republic. And so there was like a level of ignorance that was there. And until I got into school, like towards like elementary, people were like, you're black. I was like, but how do you know that? Like, nobody ever told me that I was. Like, I don't look exactly like you, but I mean, we talk the same. We kind of look the same. We do the same things, but I always thought like I wasn't black enough.
Yeah.
And then somebody had to say that I was in order for me to kind of get it. And then like I looked at my grandparents, who are super, super dark people, you know, very beautiful, 4Z hair, everything. Like they look like black people because they are black people. And then it was a realization. And then I went to my dad about it because his mother was Spanish, but he's also tied in with his black roots. And I was like, your hair's a little wavier, but aren't we still black? He's like, to an extent. It was never fully accepted in our family. So it was a little weird. But yeah, I kind of had to be the first one to kind of embrace it. Like, yeah, we are black due to our cultural ties with the motherland way far away, you know? But at the end of the day, we are still black. And like for me, it was, people kind of pushed me away, but also it was more so African Americans accepted me for being black. Like they were the ones that acknowledged my black side first. It was more like, yeah, you're the black one. Like you're accepted as black. You have a black heart. I was like, what does that even mean? Like, why are you giving me something that I didn't want, but like I just never knew about? And so that was a big thing. Like that's just a big boom in my life. Like I didn't realize what it was until I got to elementary school. But then at the same time, with, like I said, the other Hispanic kids, like the white Latinos, the black Latinos, and then like the brown Latinos, it's different because, yeah, we are treated differently. It's a whole thing with like colorism in our culture because, and back to the whole immigration thing, we were talking about this in class the other day, white Latinos tend to bow down to the white man. And I will say that bold as but they tend to bow down to the white man more than we do because they look like them. They can get those opportunities just as easily. They just have to tweak their accent a little bit.
Right.
They just have to tweak, you know, their hairstyle. Because some of them will come in with like super curly hair, they'll perm it because they want to have those opportunities too. And they know that it's easy to get them compared to me, which is not as hard because I'm not super dark. And that's a whole colorism thing. But at the same time, it's reality. I could go into something and have a better opportunity and have it handed to me a lot easier than somebody who's darker than me. And I recognize that. And that's that's another thing that we need to recognize because people are ignorant and are just like, no, we can all get the same opportunities if we work just as hard for them. And that's not the case.
All right, so here at the Soapbox, we come to solutions. So we talk a lot about becoming educated. There's a lot of miseducation here. What do you think that you can do to change the culture?
From my upbringing, because just listening to everybody talk, I just realized how different my upbringing was. Because in Cayman, when I grew up, I literally didn't recognize anybody's whiteness or anybody's like Spanishness. And I grew up with Hondurans, Jamaicans, and Caymanians, right? So even my brother right now is married to a blonde, blue-eyed girl, and she lived right down the street from me. And it wasn't until I got to like 16, and I knew her from the time I was like 9, I didn't realize she was a white woman. I really didn't, even though she looked straight up like a white girl. But she had a Caymanian accent, she grew up in the same culture, and it was so weird for me. And just everyone, even though we didn't say we were all black, we all functioned as Caymanians. And we didn't think of you differently unless you were like foreigner, but we didn't think of you differently. And I think if all of our cultures worked in that same way, where we accepted you, if you were a white person or a black person or whatever, if you accepted you full-heartedly as just a person, I think everything would be great.
From an African American's perspective, it's really hard to give you an answer because, and I'm even going to go over what you said, Kristen, because it's easy, like for you and in your upbringing, to say, I just want everybody to see everybody's people, regardless of how I look or what race you are, where you come from. That's great, and I agree with you. You're not wrong.
Yeah.
But from an African American experience,
Not realistic.
that's not realistic,
Yeah.
or at least
Yeah.
not in a time frame that's going to be suitable for like immediate
It'll
change.
take 800 years.
It'll take 800 years to rectify the 400 years that we went through, because race has been the literal thing that has defined America,
Yeah.
not just black people.
Yeah.
That's deep.
Because you could go to
Yeah.
white people, you could go to Asian people, you could go to Mexican people, for instance, you could go to whatever other Latino you want to.
Yeah.
And then we haven't even got to the black people yet. And the
Yeah.
black people were the ones who got it the worst, depending on who you ask.
Right.
But I mean, 400 years of chattel slavery, that speaks for itself. Personally, that's the way I feel about it.
Yeah.
But it's harder for us to, say, get on that boat, because us trying to extend ourselves has gotten us bit in the butt more than once.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And the more that we try and open up to the outside, that's when we get like our leaders killed.
Yeah.
And even when we've had leaders that want to keep it within the black community, the U.S. government comes in and kills them.
Yeah.
Huey Newton is a great example as a
Yeah.
Black
Right.
Panther. There's one more.
He was 21 years old.
There's one more that I'm thinking of. I can't remember his name, and I'm sorry that I can't remember his name. But he was another young activist, 21 years old, killed by his own
Yeah.
government because he was speaking out
by
for the
the
betterment
FBI.
Right.
of our community,
Yeah.
because our community had been treated so bad by the same people who wants to kill everything that's. It's crazy
Yeah.
because they tell us that they want us to be a certain way, and when we start getting to that, they realize, oh no.
Yeah.
It's kind of like Pharaoh in Egypt.
Yeah.
You start to give them too much of what they want, and then they're gonna overpower us because they're gonna remember all the things that we did to them prior to.
Right.
And that's not necessarily always the
Paranoia.
case. We just want what's good for us. So moving forward in terms of solutions, it's a little bit of what you said about how we have to kind of protect our culture a little bit, because we don't necessarily have that concrete identity. You as a Caymanian, you have a concrete identity. You as even an Afro-Latina Cuban, you have a concrete identity that you can fall back on. You as an African, even though you're African-American born here, but your
Right.
parent, you have a concrete identity.
Right.
Me as a Black American, I'm just Black. And there's a lot of facets that fall into that,
Yeah.
from the Latino/South American countries to the Caribbean to the to the
Right.
African countries. All of that makes up Blackness, because that's what Blackness is. It's an
Yeah.
amalgamation of all these things put
Right.
together and then pushed as one culture.
Yeah.
Right.
But at the same time, we don't really have the opportunity to just hold on to it,
Right.
because there's so many different things that are falling into that. So, like I said, solutions for it. On our side, personally, we have to honestly focus on what we need to do to better ourselves personally as a community. So me, like, I want to go back into LA and give back into my community. And one way that I want to do it is sports. I just started playing soccer. I was never a soccer head before because I'm American, dude. Like, I play American football. I hoop, you know, I do all this other stuff. And I didn't really understand culture until I started playing football, because that's when I realized football is bigger than the whole country. It's bigger than your people.
Yeah.
It's bigger than whatever issue that you have going on, because at least we can all come together and watch this game.
Right.
Right.
And we can all scream and shout for our team.
Yeah.
And I think once we get to that point of being able to be so proud of our culture, so proud of what we have going for us, that nobody can step on
Right.
that, I think that's what we're going to find solutions that, or more solutions that are coming from the African American community.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, well, I'm so sad that we have to end this right here, but we're out of time. It always happens. I want to thank you guys for coming on here today to talk about our cultures and what makes us so special. Thank you to the viewers that are watching this. You can use the hashtag #TheSoapbox on Twitter, Facebook, whatever social media platform that you use, and tell us what your thoughts are. Like, comment, and subscribe. We'll see you next week.
Roger that. Stop!